Hi everyone, welcome to lecture 3, Laissez, Faire, Capitalism. Okay, so in this lecture I want to explain the transition from mercantilism to free trade, or otherwise known as the French laissez-faire capitalism, so literally meaning leave alone. So a policy setting where the government has very minimal interference with the workings of business and the economy, particularly in terms of international trade tariffs and other trade barriers. So we're going to have a look at that today. Now, I'm really working hard at trying to present the theories of international political economy as a historical narrative, because it's just much more interesting. Plus I'm trying to avoid using graphs and maths, right? Unnecessary and confusing, and plus it doesn't give you any context, right? The international political economy is about the intersection of and the linkages of politics and economics, but you can't talk about, I don't think you can talk about that without giving a broader context, right? Of the geopolitical, even military, and eventually we'll get up to technology and cultural and even environmental systems that all link into international political economy. So, in this lecture, I'm going to start off with the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars to give us some context before we move into the British, or the move from mercantilism to free trade and the gold standard, really driven by the British, but really the whole world did. So that's what we're going to cover today. All right, so in 1789, France had lost the 7 Years' War with Britain and Prussia and others, and lost several territories in America and India and the islands in the West Indies and Indonesia. And France was left in serious amounts of debt, with real financial problems, and the financial reforms that King Louis XVI wanted to bring in raised taxes on everyone, but it was an extremely regressive tax, so the tax rate you paid got less as you earned more, right? So he was thinking that would get the elite on board, but in an exceptional move, and in a move that reflected the weakness of the monarchy just at that moment, because of the debts and the losses. The Parliament of Lords was refusing to ratify the tax increase, as even in its regressive nature, the Lords would have paid more tax. So in a move that is a perfect example of irony and unintended consequences, Louis XVI summoned the Estates General to ratify the tax increases. So the estates, the clergy, so they're the first estate, and the nobles were the second estate, and everyone else was the third estate. Though by this time there was lots of rich merchants, and they were so the bourgeoisie were very well represented as the third estate. And the third estate had been told that they could have twice as many representatives as the first and second estates to balance things out. But when it came to actually voting, they were informed that the vote would be as an estate. So this obviously meant the third estate would always be outvoted by 2-1, right? And so they marched out and began to meet separately in a nearby tennis court, indoor tennis court. And this was the beginning of the French Revolution that saw Louis XVI executed. You can see his head being held up there for the crowd to cheer. His death brought to an end more than 1,000 years of continuous rule by French kings in France. So those unintended consequences can be a real killer, right? So unlike anything else that had ever happened, democracy in France unites all the European monarchs, and they form what is now called the first of some 5 coalitions against France. Actually, I think there might have even been 8. I think, and so to the absolutist monarchs of Europe, who had this sort of absolute power since 1648 and the Treaty of Westphalia kind of dethroned the Pope and religion, and really allowed the power of the kings to really be unleashed, or at least unhampered by the clergy and popes. So we really had this absolutist monarchies competing in Europe ever more fiercely, and running their states to fund those military exploits. Right? So to an absolute monarch of Europe and their elite, the outbreak of revolution and democracy and regicide, right, like killing the king, in France was a threat to them all, in a way that really, no other thing really was, right? And in fact, a key organizer of the first coalition was the Holy Roman Emperor Leopold II, who was the brother of King Louis's wife and Queen Marie Antoinette, right? And she was executed several days after Louis. So this was personal, and many of the coalition and all of them, especially because all the kings and elites by this stage, after 1,000 years of intermarriage and trying to shore up treaties through marriage, all the elite, all the kings were all related to each other somehow, right? So this is personal for many of them, and all of them saw the need to crush the revolutionary idea that normal everyday people can just kill kings and rule themselves, right? That idea threatened everything. So just like the Protestant Reformation broke the power of the Pope, this revolution threatened to break the power of kings. So the first coalition went to war against France while the revolution was really happening, right? So I talked last lecture about how the organizational strength of the state was driven by war, right? And as Charles Tilly says in his great book on it, that war makes states and states make war, right? Like the organizational incentives that war generates is to create a strong organized state so that you can extract taxes, so that you can fund wars, and that military force allows you to control your country even more, and it's a secular process, right? So states were war-fighting machines, and even though the head had been cut off in France's state, right, literally, and there was an insurgency and a simmering civil war, and but the French army itself was still a war-fighting machine, and even if many of the soldiers and officers weren't sure about the revolution, they were sure that they're not going to let anyone invade France without a fight, right? So they actually went on the offensive and declared war first. And so while Paris is still in turmoil, they turned back the Prussians and the Austrians at the Battle of Valmy. There's a picture here. And emboldened by this victory, the Revolutionary Council declared the abolition of the monarchy altogether. So it wasn't just that they were getting rid of one king, which is, happened before, but they were abolishing the idea of a monarchy, and officially founded the first French Republic, right? First French democracy. And so France went on the counterattack against basically the whole world, right? Or all of Europe, right? And I suppose it was a global war because they all drew on their colonies, right? And so the first coalition was pushed back, and after 5 years of fighting, a shaky peace was signed in 1797, only for a second coalition to be formed within a year, and the war of the second coalition is fought for another 4 years, again with the French winning. And this might seem remarkable, but there were three critical things that led to French military success. And the first was that the coalition partners didn't coordinate very well, right? They were all trying to seize different bits of France, and were really trying to find a way to benefit from this, from France's ultimate defeat, right? Which didn't happen, right? And so their lack of military coordination was a big thing. Secondly, the revolutionary government of France, faced with their army being outnumbered by the combined armies of the rest of Europe, hit on the revolutionary idea of mass conscription. So they forced every able-bodied male in France from the age of 18 to 25 years old, conscripted them into the French Revolutionary Army, right? And so while the combined strength of, say, the Austrians and the Prussians, who were attacking from the east, probably numbered no more than 100,000, the French conscription soon raised at least 350,000, and within a year or two, it was probably over 800,000, and perhaps closer to 1 million. Right? So this is extraordinary for this. This was something completely new. The French Revolution changed the system of government from a monarchy to a democracy, but it also changed the system of warfare from small, mostly mercenary fighting forces, fighting limited wars for limited goals, and in terms of the damage or the costs, there's only a tiny percentage of states' populations fighting and dying, and so that limited the impact of warfare. But that all changed with the French Revolutionary Wars. So warfare changed with mass conscription to being total war, and the devastation wrought on whole populations, right? Whole generations of men killed, and if you've got small armies, you know, living off the land or whatever, stealing farmers' crops, 100,000 people is bad. But when you get up to, you know, over 500,000 or, you know, 1 million in an army, they're like a locust plague, right? So the French Revolution really changed the system of warfare that had previously been used. And we can see sort of a direct line from this mass conscription and total war. We can see a direct line from this change to the devastation of World War I, right? And World War II, that destroyed, you know, much of European civilization. And the third thing that was crucial to the military victories France achieved during these years was the military genius of Napoleon Bonaparte, of course. So he was able to harness the use of this massive war machine that this mass conscription had given France, and he rose rapidly through the ranks. He wasn't born as, you know, high-born or anything like that, and so he really excelled and quickly rose through the ranks during these revolutionary wars, and fighting the first and second coalitions, and eventually became a general of the whole army and a people's hero. Right, that's quite important. He had the support of his troops and the wider population, and so when he returned to Paris, he seized power in a coup from the revolutionary government, and effectively ended France's democratic revolution. Right, even though he preached that you know, he was fighting and continuing the revolution, he became a dictator of France, right? So eventually calling himself emperor. But he continued fighting in a series of wars called the War of the Third, Fourth, Fifth, Sixth, and Seventh Coalitions. But though after the from the third onwards, they're more normally known as the Napoleonic Wars. So over the next 12 years or so, Napoleon conquers all of Western Europe, except Portugal and the UK. And despite Napoleon ending the French democracy, his control over the whole of Europe ended any last vestiges of feudalism and serfdom. Right, he was coming as a liberator for the common people, and sort of really spread these democratic ideas of the French Revolution all over France. And as you'd know, what finally defeated Napoleon and his grand army was the sneaky Russians. The Russians refused battle, right? They would snipe and then retreat, right? And they retreated for 3 months, denying Napoleon a decisive battle. And the very sneaky thing is that along the way, they employed a scorched earth policy, right? So they burnt all the crops, all the farms, so that the advancing French army had nothing to eat, right? And as Napoleon's supply lines extended, and got longer and longer. The army was in dire straits, right? We were starving, right? So eventually the Russians retreated even out of Moscow, right? And they burnt it to the ground. Right? They burnt their own capital to the ground, right? Burnt Moscow to the ground and retreated out of it. So Napoleon can't get them cornered to destroy their army, and the Russians refused to negotiate. So in the end, Napoleon's forced to turn back before his army starves, and he tries to beat the onset of winter. Unfortunately, it is a early winter and a harsh one, and so so he began with something like 450,000 men when he invaded Russia. But by the end, he marched back to France. He only made it back with about 27,000, right? So decimated, right? And he was able to quickly restore his army to hundreds of thousands again. But this was really the turning point. He lost men and allies, and the Sixth Coalition defeated him and sent him into exile, where he escaped and was able to raise another army, only to be defeated at Waterloo in 1815. So Waterloo, so Napoleon finishes off feudalism, right, or serfdom, but Waterloo ushers in, or Napoleon's defeat, France's defeat at Waterloo, ushers in an era of British dominance, and it also marks the beginning of the end for mercantilism, right? Napoleon invaded and destroyed the home bases of the Dutch East India Company, right? Which was the vanguard of mercantilism, and allowed the British to sort of come to prominence and dominate from then on. So the Congress of Vienna was the meeting of all the restored monarchs' representatives, and they met to basically redraw the boundaries of Europe. Right? And so the goal here was not just to restore the old boundaries, but to actually resize the main powers so that they could balance each other, to achieve a balance of power, which theoretically would stop any of them trying to aim for complete dominance and control over all of Europe again, right? So like Napoleon had almost achieved. So this led to what was called the Concert of Europe, where the kings of Europe agreed to come to each other's aid in order to put down any more democratic revolutions, but also to discuss any military moves that they might make that might upset the balance of power before sort of doing them, right? It wasn't perfect, but it was actually the first real continuing cooperation beyond the coalitions. Right? So the balance of power here, or perhaps the dominance of the British at sea and in the colonies, balanced with the land-based European powers. This period sort of that came after Waterloo calmed the intensity of competition between the European monarchs, so much so that the period after Waterloo from 1815 to 1914 is often referred to as the 100 Years' Peace. So that's what was going on in the geopolitical sort of military realm, but in the theoretical, the ideas-based sort of realm, in 1776, Adam Smith publishes a very important book called The Wealth of Nations, and in it he really dismantles the underpinnings of mercantilism, right? And he shows that instead of autarky, or what autarky means, a state trying to be self-sufficient, right? So mercantilism has an extremely strong bias towards a state or a kingdom or whatever trying to not rely on anyone else, because those supply chains could be cut by war or be held ransom, right? So mercantilism is where they're trying to make everything the economy needs themselves, right? But Smith publishes an inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations, and Smith shows how rational self-interest and competition can create economic prosperity. Smith argued that letting the market decide what is produced and what a fair price is much more efficient than setting up monopolies like mercantilism did. And he mounted a devastating argument against the attempted self-sufficiency of mercantilism by showing that specialization is what increases output exponentially, right? And output or production is another way, is the way of generating wealth, right? So he uses the example of a pin factory. Smith says that the process can be broken down into 18 distinct jobs or steps, including the packaging of the pins, etc. So each worker can produce, if they do all the jobs, right? They start with, they make the metal and they make the top and put it all together and they do the whole thing. Then a fast worker can produce maybe 10 to 20 pins a day. Whereas Smith says he visited a pin factory where 10 men were producing 48,000 pins a day by specializing, right? Breaking the job down into parts, and this division of labor increases production exponentially. And so that really undercut the idea of autarky, right? Because it is easily translatable, this idea of a division of labor being the way to get wealth, to internationally, right? A state shouldn't try and do everything themselves. They should trade, right? Plus, David Ricardo introduced the idea of comparative advantage. So he gave an example of a world with no trade, and in it, England. So in his example, England produces cloth more efficiently than it does wine. So that meant an hour of labour used to make cloth in England produced more cloth than if they spent an hour of that labour producing wine, right? Portugal produces wine more efficiently than it does cloth. So if the two countries open up to trade with each other, they will buy what is cheaper abroad, right? So the English will buy Portuguese wine and the Portuguese will buy English cloth. And Ricardo argued that each should concentrate on producing what it does most efficiently and sell the excess to buy everything else, right? And the law of comparative advantage has clear free trade implications, because if a government has policies that keeps out imports, what they're doing is forcing a society to produce things that they're not very good at producing, right? So it's costly, more costly than it needs to be. So you're effectively wasting the labor of your country. So the mercantilists wanted to restrict imports and encourage exports to boost the economy, whereas the classical or the laissez-faire economists like Smith and Ricardo argue that imports are actually the gains from trade, right? Like you're getting something cheaper than you can make it yourself. And exports are what pays for that, right? So to give a smaller example, if a farmer wants to import more things into his farm, right? So buy more things. So he needs to earn more money. The best way to earn more is to do what he does best, rather than trying to build everything himself, right? So specialization and trade is how countries become wealthy. And so this was Smith and Ricardo's argument. So between them, the theoretical economic basis for mercantilism was demolished by the 1820s. But the politics took a little longer. That had to wait for a shift in the political power in England. And that really came about in 1835. Richard Cobden publishes an article called England, Ireland and America by a Manchester manufacturer. And in it, he argues that free trade would improve foreign relations, and eventually becomes a member of Parliament, where he succeeds in abolishing the Corn Laws. And these were taxes on imported grains designed specifically to keep wheat prices high to benefit the domestic farmers, right? High prices were in the interest of a few local producers. Most were lords in the House of Lords, but obviously this wasn't in the wider interest of the whole society, right? Who had to pay more for their food. So the shortages that this law created, right, actually led to starvation for many poorer people, and they were deeply unpopular. And with the expansion of the right to vote to working class or lower class people, this meant the political power shifts to a more advantageous position for general society, right? So the abolition of the Corn Laws was the first in a larger shift away from using government for creating wealth for the king and the elite and funding military expansion. It was part of a shift away from that sort of model to turning government into something that raises taxes in order to provide public goods, right? Like healthcare and welfare, etc. Right? So that's a massive shift, right? But as more classes got the vote, this political power was translated into liberal economic policies based on Smith and Ricardo and their discoveries that competition creates wealth and that free trade is beneficial for the majority of people. And so this shift is more towards a laissez-faire idea of government, where the government's role is to stay out of the way of business, to not interfere with it, and it is really just providing a level playing field for economic competition rather than creating monopolies like it was being used for before. Plus, the Industrial Revolution in Britain So the Industrial Revolution happened first in Britain, so they had a massive advantage, first mover advantage. And so it really helped that Britain at this time was really dominant in pretty well every market, right? Like they could do everything cheaper. But so there was much easier to make these changes when everything's going well, right? The economy's booming. Plus, it created a new class of factory-owning capitalists who saw mercantilism and the barriers it created, saw that as harmful to their interests in particular, right? So free trade would allow them access to other markets more. Plus, the importing of cheap corn would lower the cost of living for their workers, which meant that they could keep their wages low, right? So it's all self-interest in the end, isn't it? Plus, Great Britain was the dominant military power of the age, right? The dominant economy of the time had an absolute advantage, especially in manufactured goods. So there weren't many losers created by opening up to free trade, but there were many, many winners, right? And lots of these winners were new voters. Right? So the political economy, the shift in political power was crucial. So once the corn tariffs were dropped, it didn't take long for most tariffs in the UK to be abandoned or lowered drastically. And once Britain did, so they're the world's most dominant economy, the market, the biggest market, the market that all the rest of the world wants to sell to, right? So just like the US is today, right? So once Britain, the dominant economic and military power, rejected mercantilism, the rest of the world pretty well followed soon after. Suddenly the colonies, the British colonies, could trade at world prices, right? Buying and selling to whoever they wanted. And in 1860, France and Britain signed a free trade agreement. I think that's like the first in history, right? And as the German states united in 1871, they created a free trade area between them, which they then opened to the world. So mercantilism was dead, right? And integrating into the world economy was the idea that was being pushed everywhere. And over the course of the 1800s, the international trade of the advanced economies grew 2 or 3 times faster than their actual economies, right? The trade just exploded. And by the end of the century, trade was 7 or 8 times as large a share of global GDP as it had been at the start of the century, right? So trade just explodes. And by the end of the 1800s, so technology has really revolutionized everything as well, including trade. Right? So when Napoleon was defeated at Waterloo, it was incredibly slow and expensive to communicate internationally, let alone send cargo. Right? Cargo had to be very light and very high value, spices and gold and silver. Right? But by the end of the 1800s, the world's states, including the colonies, were crisscrossed with train lines, bringing resources and goods from the interior to the seaports. And cargo ships had all become steam-powered, right? Which went faster and could hold more and were cheaper, needing less crew and supplies. And so the Atlantic crossing from Europe to America went from taking more than a month down to less than a week, right? And the cost of bringing a ton of goods from the American interior to England dropped from $40 to less than $8. And the telegraph meant that news and communication raced around the world in minutes, not weeks or months, right? So you could coordinate trade. You could run an international company. And Europe flooded the rest of the world with these, new manufactured goods, and in turn, Europe was flooded with raw materials, right? And everything was getting cheaper. Markets became the dominant force, replacing monarchs, right? Global capital flew around the world out of Europe, right? Every, normal middle-class people were investing, in a railway line in Kenya or something, right? Like, capital flew around the world, creating investment, creating opportunities, creating jobs. And so this is a golden age of capitalism, right? So very little restrictions or regulations, really true laissez-faire capitalism. Another part of why international trade boomed during this time was that the world shared a global currency, right? Or most of the world did. So they called the gold standard. Most countries used a mixture of gold and silver interchangeably, and have done for centuries, right? Merchants used silver for lesser value exchanges and gold for larger ones, and both were legal tender pretty well everywhere, right? But in 1770, Sir Isaac Newton, who was the master of the mint in Britain, put the UK on gold exclusively. And the UK was virtually alone in this, but centuries of shared gold and silver money ended in the 1870s when large silver deposits were found in the New World and mined, and this flooded the world with silver, and it depressed the price of silver, and it forced countries to either adjust the exchange rate between gold and silver, so a task that might be never-ending now that new mines were producing silver, and it just created uncertainty about prices and was difficult. And so most countries shifted exclusively to the gold standard, with some encouragement from Britain. And this meant that, so going on a gold standard meant that they promised to actually either use just gold as their currency, which some did, have gold coins, but or to exchange its own paper currency for gold at a preset rate that couldn't really be changed except in agreement with other countries, right? So the country's currency became equivalent to gold and interchangeable with any other gold standard currency at a fixed rate. Right? And so it's really the fixed rate, it's the standard that's important, not the gold, right? But by 1879, most of the world's industrial economies were on the gold standard, and so this essentially meant that they shared an international currency, and this was incredibly useful for international trade and investment because contracted prices remained stable, like really stable. Traders wouldn't lose money because of currency exchange moves between signing a contract and getting paid, right? So the exchange rates between countries didn't change for so long that children learnt the exchange rates at school, right? But not everyone benefited from global trade or the gold standard, and the global integration itself was not without critics. The benefits of trade are always unevenly distributed, unfortunately, especially without a welfare state. And the flood of cheap raw materials, coal and farm produce from the colonies into Europe meant that coal miners and farmers in Europe suffered really badly, many starving all over Europe. And the new factories made craftsmen obsolete, and even the jobs that remained, much like what we face today, the productivity boost that technology gives means that the work of 5 people can be done by 1. So overall, this is great for society, but for the 4 people that have to find a new job, it's not so great. And it's not commonly known, but there have been 2 Great Depressions. Right? There's the one that everyone knows about in the 1930s between the world wars. But there was another one that started in 1873 and went until 1896, so 23 years. And this was called the Great Depression until the 1930s one happened. So now it's called the Long Depression. And depression might be a misleading term. This wasn't a sudden collapse like a stock market crash or something, right? This was, what happened was, because of the tremendous opening to trade that was happening and the dislocation that was happening within markets, the result was that there was a gradual and general decline in prices for everything globally, right? The prices were depressed. And so from 1873 to 1896, so 23 years, prices dropped 22% in the UK and 32% in the US and more elsewhere, right? And the dislocation of employment as trade upended markets was really problematic. And the price declines caused uncertainty and a decline in profits and wages. But importantly, the amount of repayments for any debts remained the same, right? So you're getting poorer, but your debts or rent, etc., was staying the same or going up, right? And these price drops, price declines were also uneven. So for things that were easily connected to the world market, so say wheat and coal or cotton, prices declined by around 60%. Right? But the prices of other things didn't decline at all, right? So say the cost of construction, so the cost of housing, rent, etc. And so these price drops sparked protests in farming and mining communities especially. And producers of manufactured goods also faced declining prices as more of the world industrialized and competed for markets. So Britain had a head start, but that gap was quickly closed by Germany and the US, etc. So the farmers and manufacturers demanded protection from imports, right? Exerted political pressure. And the tide of free trade began to reverse. And once that happens, it sparks trade wars, right? Which accelerates closing. France and Italy fought a particularly fierce one. And the US raised tariff walls, as did Germany, and as the end of the 1800s approached, only really Great Britain, Belgium and the Netherlands and Luxembourg stood for free trade. The rest of the world had started raising tariff barriers, and there was pressure for countries to leave the gold standard so that they could devalue their currencies, which would help their exports and make imports more expensive. And so this long depression created tensions between the major powers that had been absent for decades, right? And a new round of colonial expansion began in Africa and the Middle East and Asia as the industrial powers searched for new markets for their goods. And the major powers' troops clashed in the colonies, right, in these fields. So And there are also two major financial panics, right? So runs on banks in 1873 and again in 1893, and where major investment houses and banks collapsed. So this might all sound very familiar, right? This sounds like 2008. The gold standard for decades had been the vanguard of global capitalism and free trade, right? But things seem to be falling apart now, and even the peace between the great powers seem to be falling apart. And in the US, farmers were facing a price drop for wheat from $1 a bushel that it had been for decades to as low as 30 cents. And faced with this sort of abject poverty, the American farmers organised themselves into the country's first real mass movement, called themselves the Populist movement, and formed the People's Party and elected hundreds of legislators and senators all over the southern and western farming regions. And in 1892, the party's presidential candidate got more than 1 million votes. The Populist Party demanded first and foremost that the US go off the gold standard, which they viewed as British imperial conspiracy to enrich London bankers and enslave the world. Eventually, the Democratic Party shifted to adopt this position, with their presidential candidate giving a famous speech where he declared the worker of the world shouldn't be crucified on a cross of gold. So he only very, very narrowly lost the 1892 US election, which would have meant the US go off the gold standard. But just as the anti-gold movement was peaking in the US with the 1892 election, new and large deposits of gold were found and mined all through the colonies. Australia not the least of which. And so these gold rushes began to bring more and more gold to the market, which increased the money supply and increased prices for the first time in 23 years. In a world whose major currencies were based on gold, a decline in the price of goods was the same as an increase in the price of gold. But prospectors began scouring the earth for gold as it was getting more and more. It bought more and more things, right? The price of gold was going up, the value of it was going up. So they scoured the earth for gold and found it, right? And so the gold rush after gold rush, it doubled the supply of gold in the last 10 years of the 1800s. And this decreasing price of gold meant that it meant the increase in the price of goods, right? And this general price increase continued for the next 2 decades. And so these 20 years from 1890 onwards was really the last best gasp of laissez-faire capitalism. Those that had gone off the gold standards or had never been on it all flocked to it, and by 1908 only China and Persia were not on the gold standard. And what's important about the gold standard is it's not the gold but the standard, like I said before. You could get rid of the gold and just call it a fixed exchange rate. But having fixed exchange rates makes trade and investment internationally very stable and much safer than it would be otherwise if you had changing exchange rates. Traders aren't bankrupted by changes in the value of their currency between signing a contract and receiving payment. But there was still adjustment happening, right? It just didn't happen at the level of exchange rates. It happened within economies, right? So this is called the price specie flow mechanism, right? And what that means is that when you have fixed exchange rates, then the economies automatically adjust, or theoretically they're supposed to. So imagine, forget about paper money for a second. Just imagine a world that uses actual gold coins for currency. If one country buys more than they sell internationally, right, so they have a trade deficit, then their supply of gold, their actual money, decreases. And in order to not run out of gold, prices and wages must be pushed down so as to make their goods cheaper for international customers to buy. Then, theoretically, because their wages and prices and profits have been pushed down, their goods will sell more internationally and they will receive gold. And so they'll have a trade surplus, and their reserves will increase again. And in this way, a balance is maintained between trade and the prices of different countries. You know? And so if a country has paper money, then the government must increase or decrease the supply of paper money in order to maintain the peg to gold and not run out of gold. It does this by increasing or decreasing interest rates and taxes and spending. If it decreases the money supply, it's what's known as austerity. You'd be familiar from that from news about Greece and the UK after the global financial crisis. So governments on the gold standard fixed rate had to preference keeping their currency at this fixed rate over the needs of their domestic economy, right? So they might have to raise interest rates and cut spending and raise taxes at a time when their domestic economy might need the reverse, right? They might need increased government spending and a boost, right? But being on the gold standard meant that governments had to preference this fixed rate over the needs of their domestic economy. So, in many ways, it's very unpopular, right? And echoes of what's happened to Greece and the southern European countries being part of the euro standard, right? So they're not on a gold standard, they're on the euro. And to maintain that fixed rate, Greece has had to undergo austerity when, if they had their own currency, they would devalue their currency and try and boost their economy. Right? Okay, so, but when everything is growing and when prices are gradually rising, then a fixed rate is great. It helps immensely, it encourages trade, but when there's a problem, maintaining a fixed rate becomes very painful. So from 1897 to 1907, the world economy roared along, and in general terms, all countries were much better off, right? Individuals suffered, right? And there was dislocation and transition pain, but in general, all countries were much better off. And the New World countries like America and Australia, Brazil, and Japan all grew very wealthy and caught up with the Europeans. And it wasn't just laissez-faire for trade. It was laissez-faire for the movement of people and capital too, right? So there was no passports or visas. There was just free movement of people, right? And so countries with excess labour, you know, those people moved to Australia and America, etc., you know, chasing gold and farming land, and so from an classical economist point of view, the global economy was operating as efficiently as it could, right? and investment money poured out of the European countries into the New World too. So, so this was the peak of laissez-faire. What brought this global economic boom to an end was World War I. The causes of World War I are still debated, and it's probably not possible to put your finger on exactly what caused why World War I happened. What we can say is that the origin of the war was based in the desire of the Slavic peoples in Bosnia and Herzegovina to no longer be part of the Austria-Hungary Empire, and instead they wanted to be part of Serbia, which is a little tragic because in 1992 they fought a war against the Serbs, but that's another story. So that was sort of the background cause. The trigger was the terrorist attack and assassination of the Austrian Archduke Ferdinand and his wife by a member of the Bosnian Serbian nationalist terrorist organisation called the Black Hand. And Ferdinand's death, so that assassination was interpreted as a product of official Serbian government policy, right? And because it was interpreted like that, it created what's called the July crisis. So a month of diplomatic and governmental miscalculations, driven by a desire not to be slow in mobilising their armed forces and being caught off guard. Everyone mobilised, and this creates a perfect security dilemma, right? If you've done any other sort of international relations theory, you'd be familiar with the security dilemma, and that saw a domino effect of war declarations initiated, and because of the alliance system at the time, this little dispute between Austria and Serbia and a little portion of its territory escalated immediately to a European-wide war, right? Because everyone had promised to come to the aid of everyone else, right? So tensions had been building, and an arms race was well underway. Germany had briefly invaded France and seized some very important border territory that had a lot of coal and heavy industry of France. So there was already military tensions and economic tensions, and there were clashes in the colonies and at sea, and trade tensions flared often. So the 100 Years' Peace wasn't always a peace, and the rise of free trade over mercantilism wasn't uniform, and the gains from trade were very unequally spread. But the decades before 1914 were, by comparison with the horrors that came afterwards, immensely better for everyone, right? So in the next lecture, we'll look at the change in warfare that World War I brought. And so I'll leave it there. I hope you found that interesting, the decline of mercantilism and the rise of free trade and the gold standard. And stay safe and well, and I'll talk to you next lecture.